This class consciousness, however, has been notoriously avoided by the professional middle class themselves. In his 1976 Notes and Commentary on the Irresistibility of the Petty Bourgeois, German author, and who is better equipped to articulate the former barriers of professionalization than a real-life veteran of the Hitler Youth, Hans Magnus Enzensberger argued that the managerial class could be defined precisely by its inability to attain consciousness of itself as a class. Enzensberger included managers, specialists, technocrats, technical intelligentsia in the ranks of those who were neither capitalists nor workers. Like Ehrenreich, Enzensberger considered himself a member of this class and attempted to hold a mirror up to it. Quote, "So we belong to a class that neither controls nor owns what matters, the famous means of production, and does not produce what also matters, the famous surplus value, or perhaps produces it only indirectly and incidentally. But ultimately, he concluded that," and it gives this excerpt here, "for just as this class can be defined only in negative terms, so its self-understanding is also negative. The petty bourgeois wants to be anything other than a petty bourgeois. He tries to gain his identity, not by allegiance to his class, but by separating himself off from it and denying it. But what links him with his own kind is just what he contests. The petty bourgeois is always someone else. This strange self-hatred acts as a cloak of invisibility. With its help, the class as a whole has made itself almost invisible. Solidarity and collective are out of the question for it. It will never attain the self-consciousness of a distinct class." Proving Enzensberger's point, the very existence of a professional managerial class is often most controversial among the sort of left-wing intellectuals who might fit the description. Take, for example, David Sessions' recent Jacobin article, The Right's Phony Class War, in which he rejects the mythical managerial class as a right-wing boogeyman conspiracy theory, referring to it as a pseudo-sociology that pits an ambiguous managerial or cosmopolitan ruling class against the rest of the country, and lets the people who actually hold political and economic power off the hook. It's worth noting here that theorists of the PMC do not consider it a ruling class by definition, but rather a category with a relationship to capital that is distinguishable from both capitalist and worker. By contrast, Ehrenreich made no bones about exposing the ideology of her own frenetic class. And like Enzensberger, Ehrenreich understood the importance of such a class's apparent instability in the midst of the ongoing class war. Enzensberger believed that the center could not hold, that some of the middle class would join the goats of capitalism, while most would eventually be proletarianized with the sheep and reap the fruits of socialism. Such an outcome had not come to pass when Enzensberger was writing, leaving him to contemplate the inscrutable resilience of the professional middle class. His conclusion was that the middle classes, by virtue, or sin if you prefer, of their position as a multiply articulated assemblage, retained an adaptability, or characterless opportunism. His description of this ethos was damning. Never to take a final stand, and to seize every possibility. Those are the only lessons that the class has learned from its variegated history. This adaptability had occasionally led the PMC to progressive politics, as has occurred recently, but, he observed, this is not a fixed feature so much as a strategy that lends credibility to its secure role as the architects of cultural hegemony, or rather, seemingly secure role. It turns out that all Enzensberger had to do was wait a bit longer. Free fallen. Then Jesus said unto him, Put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Matthew 26:52. Fear of Falling, which came out only 13 years after Enzensberger's treatise, sought to analyze the unease inherent in professional middle-class consciousness, highlighting the instability and insecurities of this class from its explosion in the early post-war period to the 1960s students' movement and counterculture, right up to the yuppies. Ehrenreich described an intense ambient anxiety and defined distinct historical periods of social panic endemic to the PMC, who were neurotically self-reflective, but completely lacking in self-awareness. The root of this neurosis was the historic ambivalence and dread with which the class understood itself as a tenuous elite that may or may not succeed in reproducing itself as a class. Unlike other classes, each generation of the PMC had to earn its status through educational credentialing, qualifying employment, and professional achievement. As the shock troops of Taylorism, it was as if the PMC always knew on some level that Taylorism would come for it one day as well. Later we learned that these insecurities were justified, and that the fear of falling was a valid concern. The PMC Ehrenreich described in 1989 was a bubble, a temporary post-war glitch. Ehrenreich revisited fear of falling in a 2013 essay for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Death of a Yuppie Dream, in which she performed a thorough postmortem of her own declining class. In an addendum, she and her ex-husband, John Ehrenreich, analyzed the absorption of the liberal professions into corporation-like enterprises, looking at healthcare, legal work, journalism, and publishing. All fields had been undergoing corporatization for the last 50 years, rapidly accelerating since the 1990s, and it was clear that while the liberal professions persisted, their former power was being thoroughly eroded by neoliberalism. In the essay proper, however, she reflects with some ambivalence on the PMC nosedive. Quote, "Should we mourn the fate of the PMC, or rejoice that there is one less smug, self-styled elite to stand in the way of a more egalitarian future? A case has been made here for both responses. On the one hand, the PMC has played a major role in the oppression and disempowering of the old working class. It has offered little resistance to, and in fact supplied the manpower for, the rights campaign against any measure that might ease the lives of the poor and the working class. On the other hand, the PMC has at times been a, quote, liberal force, defending the values of social scholarship and human service in the face of relentless pursuit of profit," unquote. It seems to me that Ehrenreich has answered her own question here. The PMC have been, at best, fair-weather friends to the working class, and at worst, have been even more devious exploiters by dint of their liberal credibility. As the class which ushered in neoliberalism, I would denounce the crimes of the PMC far more forcefully than Ehrenreich. When the PMC are flying high, their middle-class liberal initiatives to combat poverty have been inhumanely punitive and ineffectual. Policies like prohibition, eugenics, and broken windows policing come to mind. On the institutional level, liberal think tanks like the Center for American Progress and wealthy NGOs like the Gates and Ford Foundations have reliably pushed for neoliberal policies and private sector solutions to poverty, conveniently avoiding expropriation, redistribution, and universal public programs and services. Yes, it's true that civil rights, women's liberation, and gay rights have seen some incredibly successful campaigns fought by coalitions of leftists and liberals, but such battles are easier to fight than class war, in no small part because they inevitably promise a few choice spots for the PMC compradors. Even many New Deal liberals only assented to economic reforms under coercion, their support secured by the implied threat that something more extreme might be around the corner if they didn't appease an ambitious American workers' movement. So I do not weep for this sinking ship, and would instead save my tears for the members of the working class who have been left with the check, though they may now include a number of recent PMC exiles, which leads me to the more practical question. Will a sizable number of these erstwhile PMC join the sheep, or will most of them instead identify with the goats, following Steinbeck's pathetic, quote, temporarily embarrassed millionaires? Or will they find no class consciousness at all, drifting into lumpen listlessness, atomized from both flock and herd? And then we have a quote here from Ehrenreich's Fear of Falling. What does the professional middle class have to gain, or perhaps to lose, in a more egalitarian future? The problem with middle-class liberalism, perhaps the worst problem, was that it never asked the question. It assumed that American affluence was sufficient to embrace all those in poverty without any loss to those who were not. And it assumed that any gains to the middle class itself would be purely spiritual, leaving the way open for right-wing theories of the liberal elite's real motives and agenda. I am a longtime member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, a curiously wholesome anti-capitalist organization founded in 1982 by Cold War-era Social Democrat Michael Harrington, just before liberals like Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history. The DSA has been for some time the largest socialist organization in the United States, and it has been a strange, sometimes joyous, and often distressing experience watching the membership explode and the organization change after Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. Funnily enough, Barbara Ehrenreich was once an honorary chair of the DSA, though that position was abolished at the 2017 National Conference in a fit of Oedipal exuberance. I am still at times asked to speak at DSA events, including a recent one for the DSA Tech Action Working Group, a decidedly PMC collection of DSA members working in tech. Inspired by Google software engineer James Damore's infamous anti-diversity memo, the subject I was to speak on was diversity in tech. The friend who asked me to speak rightly recognized that the tech industry is no longer a small cabal of entrepreneurial specialists, but is increasingly expanding into a global labor force of workers, from petit bourgeois to prole, if you will. I cannot, however, say I found many examples of such workers at this event. Multiple representatives from HR departments spoke up, one to say that, quote, "It's all about hiring practices," quote unquote, and to urge the attendees to come to HR whenever they had a problem. One woman wanted to read a long academic article about a typesetter's union fighting automation and other changes that would open the floodgates for underpaid, largely female scab labor. She was under the impression that this exposed the sexist nature of trade unions. The crowd was very diverse in all the IKEA commercial ways that warm our Coca-Cola liberal hearts. But some of the most insightful observations came from the bearded and presumably cishet white males. One timidly put forth that, quote, HR actually works for management, unquote, while another recognized that the biggest source of diversity in the tech industry is highly exploited third world call center workers. At first glance, the superior class consciousness of the beardy white male tech bro may appear counterintuitive, but it is a function of tech industry managerialism that he has a better view of class conflict. As an industry, tech has thoroughly absorbed diversity into its corporate culture and HR programming, for both legal liability and liberal credibility reasons. If you're a woman and or minority working for Google and your job is miserable, you are told by the whole world and by your employer itself that this is because you are a woman and or a minority. But you are also told your employer is here with sensitivity trainings, diversity initiatives, and at-will firing practices, for the bad employees, to remedy all of that and to build a better work environment and, thereby, a more egalitarian world. If, however, you are a straight white man working for Google and your job is miserable, you know it's because your job is miserable, and the company isn't there to help you. Liberal identitarian HR obfuscations don't work as well on exploited and precarious dude bros. The evening culminated during the Q&A, wherein a woman earnestly asked, "What do I do if some alt-right guy wants to be in the union?" Visibly vexed, I replied that if an alt-right guy wants to be in your union, you won.